Good morning. Lovely to be with you, even if it's only through YouTube. I want to talk to you this morning about the evidence for the Christian faith. I came to faith at St Andrew's College many years ago through two of my own matric pupils, and I think they were as surprised as I was. It was a really dramatic Damascus Road conversion. And the chaplain, who was a wonderful man called Hilton Knowles, gave me almost immediately a discipleship, or as we called it, a divinity class to teach. And once I told them what God had done for me, I hadn't really a clue as to how to go on from there. But over a couple of years, I began to ask myself the question, what is it that 14-year-olds need to hear? And so I would tell them how I'd come to faith. And then I'd show them videos of surfers. There's one in particular called Changes, which is very good. You can access part of it from walking on water films. But then I decided, as the result of a challenge from a pupil, to start investigating the objective evidence for the Christian faith. One 15-year-old one day said to me in a divinity class, go on, prove it. Prove that Jesus ever lived. And I did not know what to say. I hadn't a clue. And I went, and I think God put in my hands a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. Now, he was a university student in America who was pretty anti-Christian, or fiercely anti-Christian. And he was challenged by his Christian friends. They said, if you're so convinced that the Christian faith is not true, we challenge you to write a book proving that it's not true. Well, they actually used the wrong word, as we'll see later. They should have said providing evidence that it wasn't true. Because what I discovered in the book that he finally wrote, and by the way, it's something now like 1,100 pages, but the book that he finally wrote, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, went through the objective evidence for the Christian faith. You know, when I say objective, it's something that you and I can sit down and look at together. Subjective evidence would be, for example, my telling you how I came to faith. And you might say to me, well, that's all very well for you, but I've never had an experience like that. And with subjective evidence, stuff that's happened to me, or somebody else who's giving you their testimony, you either accept it or you reject it. But with objective evidence, you can sit and look at it together. The first thing I learned really shocked me, and that was there was no such thing as proof in history. I can boil water at 100 degrees Celsius every day at sea level, and I can prove to you, as it were, that it will do that day after day, provided that the water is sorry, I'm just turning my phone off because it's not a good idea to have it on while, as you probably heard. If the water's pure, and if the barometric pressure is 1 bar, and we're at sea level, it will boil at 100 degrees Celsius every day of the week. But I cannot repeat events in history. By the way, that applies to evolution as well. Now, I don't believe in neo-Darwinism and the evolutionary theory. I'm a creationist. But when evolutionists come along and say they can prove this and that, they're talking nonsense, because it's a matter of evidence, not proof. You cannot prove anything in history. But you can have evidence. So when pupils said to me, you go on, prove that Jesus ever lived. In later years, I'd say, well, I can't. But you can't prove Adolf Hitler lived either. And they'd say, yes, of course we can. And I'd say, well, how? And they'd say, well, there's film. And I said, but film can be faked. How many of you don't believe that Apollo 11 landed on the moon? And of course, there were 3 in every class who'd seen the Discovery program on DSTV, where they came up with this conspiracy theory. So I said, why don't you believe Apollo 11 landed on the moon? And they'd say, well, the flag was waving in the wind, and there's no wind on the moon. And I said, the Americans know that. They wired the flag. Of course there's no wind. There's no atmosphere. What good would a flag just hanging limply be? So they wired it, and when Buzz Aldrin deployed it, he bent the pole. And in any case, as he untwisted the pole to deploy the flag, there was an equal and opposite reaction. What else? Oh, well, there were no stars in the photograph in the black sky, so it must have been done in a studio. And I said, well, the surface of the moon is highly reflective. They had to use an incredibly fast shutter speed on their cameras. Otherwise, everything would have been one incandescent glow. In fact, they couldn't see the stars themselves because their eyes were like the pupils had narrowed down to real pinpricks to protect their sight. I said, what else? Well, then they produced what they thought was their trump card. They said that when Buzz Aldrin descended the ladder of the lunar module, and you can have a look on the internet and see if you can find pictures of him. He comes down the shady side of the lunar module, but he's all lit up. So it must have been studio lighting, they said. And I said, again, it's the reflective surface of the moon. Go and look at a full moon one night. It's highly reflective. Well, they said there was no dust crater for the descent engine of the lunar module. I said the moon's surface is, they discovered, hard. Only a few millimeters of dust on the surface, which did get scattered. But I said, what you are saying shows that you cannot prove anything in history. It's evidence. I can't prove to you they landed on the moon. I said, personally, if you don't believe that, I think you're a fruitcake. But, and of course the evidence for Hitler is overwhelming, but the point is it's evidence, not proof. And I said, one of the things that you learn in history is there is a significant difference between what they call secondary evidence or secondary eyewitnesses and the eyewitnesses who actually see something happen as primary evidence. For example, you might say to me, I've heard that there's been a car accident down the road. That's secondary evidence. But if you come in and say, I've just seen the most terrible car accident down the road, you are a primary witness and you are offering primary evidence. My next question to pupils would be, well, if evidence is going to be transmitted, how can we actually do that? And the answer is we transmit evidence by either speaking it out or writing it down. And I said, which do you think is the most convincing, the most accurate, the most reliable way of doing it? So let me give you a second or two to think about that. What would you say? Speaking it or writing it down? Well, they all said speaking it out. And I said, well, the police would not agree with you. The police would definitely not agree with you. Excuse me a second. Don't worry, it's not coronavirus, and you couldn't get it from YouTube anyway. So the police, if you go to the police and report an accident, they will want you to write it down or speak it out so they can write it down. They call it making a statement. Why do they want it in writing? Why do they know that this is the most reliable way to record evidence? The answer is because once you've signed that statement, if you in court now come up with something different from what you said in the statement, they'll pounce on you immediately and say, but that's not what you said in the statement. So once it's written down, it's more difficult to change. In fact, in police evidence, it's completely impossible. So if once we've established that written evidence is more reliable, my next question would be, well, let's go back a couple of 100 years to the Battle of Waterloo, fought between the British and the French army. Basically, it was the British and the Prussians against the French and their allies. And I said, do we have any eyewitnesses for this event? And again, I'd like to ask you just to think about that for a minute. Are there any eyewitnesses for the Battle of Waterloo? Well, if you like the classes that I taught, you will have said, no, of course not. They're all dead. And I would say, yes, they are dead, but there were definitely eyewitnesses. They left written accounts. We wouldn't actually know what had happened in the Battle of Waterloo if there weren't eyewitness accounts. And of course, there were eyewitness accounts from different parts of the battlefield. We wouldn't expect every eyewitness to tell exactly the same story. They'd obviously get the main facts. They would agree on the main facts. I mean, to use another analogy, if you and I were watching a rugby match, and we would agree on the score if we wrote a written account of the game afterwards. But let's say it's a Springboks England rugby match, and you're supporting the Springboks, and let's say, for argument's sake, I'm supporting England. And let's say the English fly half scored. I might write in my account, he sold a brilliant dummy and went in under the posts for a converted try. You, on the other hand, might have said the Springbok defense was lamentable, and the Springbok number 10 missed an easy tackle to concede a soft try. Basically the same facts told from a different perspective. But even more, I might notice something that you didn't. I might have noticed that the Springbok number 4 punched somebody as a ruck was ending. And then I started to follow him around and saw him do it again and said to you, your Springbok number 4 has just punched somebody, and you might have followed him and said, goodness me. But the ref didn't see it. So we wouldn't expect eyewitness accounts of the same event to agree 100%. It would be highly suspicious if they did. It's what police would call collusion. A law court would look at this and say this evidence has been rigged because this is uncanny. The agreement is complete and utter. So when we look at the gospel accounts of Jesus, we wouldn't expect them to agree absolutely 100%, but we would expect the writers to have seen things from a different perspective. For example, John, one of the disciples, was the only disciple, the only male disciple, to stand up close at the foot of the cross. And he records the fact that when a spear was thrust into Jesus's heart area, that blood and water came out. None of the other accounts mention this. Similarly, he had contacts in the high priestly group, and he was able possibly to know things that the other gospel writers didn't. Luke, on the other hand, was not an eyewitness, but he consulted eyewitnesses all the time and relayed their evidence. He must have had long conversations with the mother of Jesus to know so much about the birth of Jesus. And you might be interested to know Luke is now regarded as one of the most accurate historians in the ancient world. But let's go back even further than the actual Battle of Waterloo. Let's go back 2,000 years or more to a character in history I'm sure you've heard of, Julius Caesar. If you've read the Asterix books, you would have had a quite distorted picture of Julius Caesar. He was a brilliant general. He conquered Gaul, and sorry to burst your bubble, but there was no village that survived, no Asterix. Although the writer of that series certainly got the names right, and his Latin is impeccable. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul in 10 years. It was a massive territory that the Gauls had given Rome the most incredible trouble for 300 years, and Julius Caesar conquered Gaul in 10 years. Later, he made himself dictator by force and wanted to make himself king, and you remember that he was assassinated. How do we know that? Yes, there were eyewitnesses. They left a written account. He was stabbed to death in public, and by a group of, I think, 12 conspirators. One of them was Marcus Brutus, whom it is reliably thought was Caesar's own son, because Brutus's mother, Servilia, was Caesar's mistress. And when Brutus finally stabbed him, we're told by one historian, Greek historian, or Greek-speaking historian, that Jesus, at least that Caesar said, "Kai su teknon," and you too, my child, rather than the et tu brute that Shakespeare describes. Caesar, before he died, left an account of his wars in Gaul. He couldn't just type it up on a laptop. It had to be handwritten. And in the next clip that you will see, I will describe to you how documents in the ancient world were written, how they were copied, and the results of all that. I hope you've enjoyed what I've had to say, and I now hope that you will be able to have a discussion with your teacher so far. You might start by telling your teacher what you've actually learned that you didn't realize. Perhaps it might be the fact that there's no such thing as proof in history. By the way, there's no such thing as proof in a law court. There's very strong evidence. But you know, evidence can be contaminated. Anyway, God bless, and we'll chat soon.